The flood did not happen for the reason almost everyone was taught. And the problem is not theology, it is the text itself. Before the water covered the earth, the Bible describes something very specific: widespread violence, the earth corrupted, life becoming impossible to sustain. Curiously, the text does not begin by speaking of individual sin. It describes a system out of control. If the flood were merely moral punishment, the narrative would be simple. But the biblical account insists on something deeper and more uncomfortable. In this video, we will examine what the text actually states and why the reason for the flood is not the one that is usually repeated. Most people reduce the flood to a simple phrase: the world sinned, God punished it, the story moved on. This reading is comfortable because it organizes everything quickly. There is guilt, there is punishment, there is closure. But when the biblical text is read carefully, something does not fit. Genesis does not begin by describing individuals failing morally. It describes an entire setting deteriorating. Violence spreads. The earth becomes corrupted. Life stops functioning as it should. This is not a list of personal sins. It is the portrait of a system that has lost control. And that creates a serious problem for the traditional explanation, because moral punishment deals with individuals. It does not explain an entire world collapsing at the same time. If the flood were merely a response to human sin, the text could say so directly. But it insists on something broader, more structural, more difficult to simplify. Before the waters rose, the Bible points to a world that was already broken. And understanding how it reached that point is what completely changes the reading of the flood. This is where the story begins to feel uncomfortable. When the account of the flood begins to take shape, the Bible does not present a sermon. It presents a diagnosis. Genesis states that the earth was corrupted before God and that violence spread everywhere. This description is broad, impersonal, almost technical. It does not first point to specific individuals, but to the state of the world as a whole. The text does not enumerate transgressions. It does not list crimes. It does not construct a detailed moral judgment. It describes a condition. The word used for corrupted does not suggest merely ethical failure, but deterioration. Something that has lost its original form. Something that no longer fulfills its function. The same applies to violence. It does not appear as an isolated event, but as a pattern that overtook the earth. This completely changes the framing of the narrative, because the problem presented is not only who did something wrong, but what the world became. Another rarely observed detail is that God does not react immediately. There is an interval, a span of time in which the text describes the situation before any decision is made. This delay matters. It indicates that the flood does not emerge as an outburst of momentary anger, but as a response to a process that was already underway. The earth, as it is described, is not merely guilty, it is compromised. And this raises an inevitable question. If the problem were only moral, why would the text insist so strongly on describing the condition of the world before the action? At this point, the simple explanation begins to fail. because it cannot absorb the weight of what is being said. The text is preparing the reader for something larger, and it has not yet said everything. When the traditional explanation claims that the flood happened because of human sin, it seems to resolve everything far too quickly. The world errs, God reacts. The story is closed. It is simple. It is functional. But that is not what the text describes when it is read carefully. In Genesis, the language used does not point to an accumulation of individual failures, but to a general collapse. Violence does not appear as the result of isolated choices, but as an entire environment saturated by it. Corruption is not portrayed as a momentary deviation, but as a continuous state of the earth. This detail is decisive, because moral punishment, by definition, responds to acts. But the text is not dealing only with acts. It is dealing with a condition that spread and became established. Another point that weakens the common explanation is the absence of appeals for collective repentance in the account. There is no explicit call for humanity to change its behavior before the final decision. The text does not construct a scene of public warning. It describes, observes, and concludes. This creates an unsettling silence. If the problem were merely moral, we would expect warning, correction, an attempt at direct restoration. But what we see is something else, a narrative that treats the state of the world as something that has already crossed a threshold. The Bible states that all flesh had corrupted its way. This phrase does not point only to guilt. It suggests structural deviation, something that has left its intended course and cannot be restored by simple adjustment. At this point, the popular explanation begins to lose its force, because it answers a question the text is not asking. It speaks of individual sin when the text is speaking of an entire world out of place. And when that happens, an uncomfortable possibility emerges. Perhaps the flood was not merely a punishment, but a response to something that could no longer continue to exist as it was. The text does not say this openly yet, but the direction is becoming clear, and it is precisely here that the traditional reading begins to prove insufficient. Up to this point, the account of the flood could be read as an expansion of a moral problem. But at a certain moment, the text does something subtle and decisive. It shifts its focus. God does not describe only what human beings did. He describes what the earth became. The narrative moves its attention from individual behavior to the state of creation. Corruption is not presented as a collection of scattered acts, but as a condition that overtook the entire environment. This shift matters because it reveals the nature of the problem. The text is not dealing merely with transgression, but with distortion. Something that was meant to sustain life began to produce it in a disordered way. The world, as it is described, ceased to fulfill its original function. Another frequently ignored detail is the way God justifies the decision. He does not speak of vengeance. He does not speak of exemplary correction. He states that the end of all flesh has come, because the earth is filled with violence. The reason given is not only ethical, it is almost operational. Violence appears as a symptom of something larger. It is not merely sin, it is a sign of a system that has collapsed. When the text says that the earth was corrupted before God, the image is not only of guilt, but of exposure. The problem became visible, undeniable, impossible to ignore. At this point, the narrative begins to suggest that the flood is not an isolated act, but an extreme intervention, not to punish specific individuals, but to interrupt a process that had spread without control. This explains why the text devotes so much space to describing the world before the waters, and relatively little to the waters themselves. The center of the narrative is not the cataclysm. It is the condition that made the cataclysm necessary. The traditional explanation stumbles here because it insists on reducing everything to a simple moral category. But the text is operating on another scale. It is describing a world that had become unviable. And when the story is read this way, the flood ceases to look like an impulsive punishment. It begins to look like a final response to something that could no longer be reversed. The text still holds its conclusion, but the direction has already been set. After describing the state of the world, the biblical text introduces a decisive idea. A limit has been crossed. This limit is not presented as an accumulation of sins, but as the recognition that life, as it was being lived, could no longer continue. When God states that the end of all flesh has come, the phrase does not sound like a threat. It sounds like a final diagnosis. The text does not describe a God reacting emotionally, but acknowledging that something has reached an irreversible point. This detail changes everything, because irreversibility is not common moral language. It is the language of collapse. Something has moved from a stage where correction is possible to one where the only option left is interruption. The text reinforces this by repeating that the earth was filled with violence. The repetition does not serve to intensify guilt, but to underline the scope of the problem. There are no preserved areas left, no meaningful exceptions. The entire environment has been overtaken by the same pattern. In this context, the flood begins to appear not as exemplary punishment, but as the closure of a cycle. The world described is no longer merely unjust, it is unviable. This helps explain why the narrative does not invest in attempts at reform. There are no plans for gradual correction, no instructions for collective change. The text assumes that the process has already solidified. This is where the simplified explanation finally collapses, because it imagines a God reacting to behaviors. The text, however, describes a reality that has lost the capacity to sustain life in an ordered way. The reason for the flood starts to take clearer shape. It is not only about punishing evil, but about preventing it from continuing to spread without limit. The extreme action emerges as a response to a world that has passed the point of return. Even so, the text does not close the issue in abstract theological terms. It remains faithful to the narrative. It shows, it describes, it allows the reader to feel the weight of the decision before any explicit conclusion. And it is precisely this restraint that makes the story so uncomfortable. Because the flood ceases to be merely a distant episode. It becomes a warning about what happens when an entire system comes apart. The conclusion is near. But the text still demands attention. When the flood is reduced to a punishment for sin, the story loses its most unsettling dimension. It becomes a simple moral episode, distant, almost comfortable. But the biblical text never treats the event in this way. What Genesis describes is a world that has crossed a limit. Not merely people doing wrong, but an entire structure distorted. Violence does not appear as an occasional failure, but as the dominant pattern. Corruption is not a detail, but the general condition of the earth. In this context, the flood ceases to be an impulsive reaction and is presented as the final interruption of something that could no longer continue. Not because God ceased to be patient, but because the world described had lost the capacity to sustain life as it was created to exist. This reading changes the weight of the narrative. The flood is not only about guilt, it is about collapse, about systems that deteriorate to the point where they can no longer be corrected by simple adjustments, about realities that reach a stage where continuing is more destructive than stopping. Perhaps this is why the text devotes so much space to what happens before the waters and so little to the event itself. The focus was never the cataclysm. It was the condition that made it inevitable. And when this story is read carefully, it ceases to be merely an ancient account. It becomes a silent warning, not about isolated individual errors, but about what happens when violence, disorder, and corruption become the normal state of things. The flood, then, does not answer only the question, what did God punish? It raises another, far more uncomfortable one. What happens when an entire world loses control of itself? The text offers no simple answer. It merely leaves the warning recorded. And perhaps that is exactly what makes this story impossible to ignore.